This bill has been presented, and in fact we have two bills before the committee today, which have been presented as solving the problem of people blocking highways. But unfortunately, only one of these two bills is really specifically directed at that problem, And that's the bill we'll be hearing later, Representative Canario's bill, House 5193. The bill that we have now was described in the media as if it would be focused on blocking highways, but in fact it covers a far broader swath than that. And that's one thing that I hope the media will get straight. If you want a bill that's directly about blocking highways, that's the other bill, 5193, the misdemeanor bill we're about to hear later. If you want a bill that covers blocking highways and a whole lot of other vague stuff, then that's the bill that we have today. So the question in passing this bill is, do we want to criminalize other stuff besides blocking highways? And I think that deserves clear attention. This bill goes beyond the circumstances that prompted it. The circumstances that prompted this bill was one or two isolated protests blocking highways. In fact, the bill was introduced right after a protest that wasn't even in Rhode Island. It was in Massachusetts. The bills were presented as a response to that. However, it goes beyond that in several different ways. First of all, it's not limited to freeways. This bill that we're discussing now covers any street that happens to be designated as a state or federal highway, which is many streets, including Smith Street. Second, as has been pointed out in detail, this bill makes it a felony, which almost everybody who's spoken seems to consider inappropriate, including defenders of the bill. Third, this bill makes the criteria for conviction a lot more subjective. In this bill, people can be convicted not just if they restrict traffic, but under a lot of circumstances which are really vague. Includes language, and the bill includes language about can be construed as interfering with traffic. What kind of things can be construed as interfering with traffic? Well, they'll haul you up into court on a felony charge, and you'll have to bear the burden of defending against the felony charge, which is not cheap in time or money, in order for the court, in its discretion, to decide whether you can be reasonably construed as interfering with traffic. That's forget even the jail sentence, just threatening somebody with that kind of journey into court, with that kind of sentence potentially hanging over them on subjective criteria, that's enough of a threat in itself. So this bill is really vague. So one difference between this bill and the misdemeanor bill we'll be hearing later is the misdemeanor bill actually says you have to cause harm, you have to restrict the flow of traffic. In this bill that we see before us now, it's not even restricted to those who intentionally do things. As other people pointed out, this bill applies to people who didn't intend to even interfere with traffic, but who are construed as doing that recklessly. And this bill even goes further. It says that you can be covered under this bill for causing a distraction. Now, we all know that this bill is in response to protests. This bill is meant to cover not just the protests on the freeway, but a much wider swath of protests. And what kind of protest on the street could not be considered as causing a distraction for motorists? I'm sorry, I just don't see that. So in all these ways, this bill goes beyond the things that are the factual event that prompted it. It's using that event as an occasion to criminalize far more than that. And so the question we have to face today is, how much further do we want to go? How much further do we want to go? Do we want to make it a felony? Do we want to cover all these vague kinds of offenses that nobody knows whether they are guilty of or not? Do we want to cover streets as well as highways? My answer to that is we shouldn't go any further than the misdemeanor bill that's coming up now. Because this bill that we're seeing now I mean, let's just take the one distinction here, which is the distinction between a bill covering just blocking the highway and a bill covering protesters that happen to be on a street, who have their boot on the ground like a firefighter, as it was said before. Well, okay, should we criminalize people who happen to have their feet on the paved area of the street, or just people who are blocking the highway? There's a big reason why we want to criminalize specifically people who are blocking the highway, and that's because, and when I say highway, I mean the freeway, the limited access freeway, and that's because freeways are limited access. If you have people blocking a freeway, then that actually does cause problems with ambulances. It does cause problems for ordinary motorists who have a lot of trouble getting on and off and getting around it. If you have people who are having a protest on something and happen to be setting foot in the street, which happens often, then any motorist who's frustrated can just drive around them. And that goes for ambulances, which have no trouble turning their siren on and going around them. It goes for ordinary motorists too. So there's a very good reason for restricting this to the freeway, which is what has been presented in the media as doing. And if you go beyond that and try applying to some streets that happen to be designated as highways, then the public will know this is a bill that's meant to target protest more generally. It's not meant to just target the alleged wrong that was supposed to prompt it. So I want to point that out. And one of the other people giving testimony mentioned that they were getting lots of signatures on this. I mean, I see lots of signatures on the petition I started, which has been up only about 24 hours or less. But I've been getting signatures very rapidly, over 60 signatures in less than a day, and it hasn't been publicized very much. And what I see as comments on these, on the petitions is very interesting, because the petition lets people make comments when they sign, and a lot of those comments are saying, are taking the approach that
we're looking forward to getting the petition, and we'll let the petition and the comments speak for themselves.
Okay, well then I won't quote the people who signed the petition, but
Yeah,
I will say for myself, that if you respond, if you use this occasion of a highway blocking in Massachusetts as an excuse for making a far broader group of protest activities legal, then I will not take that well, and I know a lot of people will not take that well. I mean, in the past, when people talked about, when groups that I've been in talked about traveling protests blocking the highway, we decided on our own. We don't want to do it. It wasn't because of the law, it was because of consideration for others. But let's remember, the reason behind this protest originally is because of this crisis, which has gotten a lot of public sympathy and support, the crisis of people getting killed by police, of police abusing their authority, making mistakes, or even not so much mistakes, and killing people who should not be killed. And that's a real problem. We've seen on social media, on the hashtags, we've seen in all sorts of ways. It's gotten a lot of public sympathy. And I'm not saying anything about whether it's right or wrong to block the highway over that, but the fact is, this is a big public crisis that so far the state legislature has not done anything to address. And the only thing the state legislature has done in response to the crisis, in response to the protests about it, is they've used this protest as this one protest in Massachusetts and one in Rhode Island as an opportunity to introduce a bill that makes a whole lot of other things illegal. And look, just from a rational point of view, this is completely crazy.
Randall, let's maybe only a couple more hands.
Okay, just a little bit. Okay, let me just point out.
You made a number of great points.
I understand. I just want to say one more thing, and then I'll wrap up. Just want to say that if the nation and many people in this state are concerned about police abusing their authority, it doesn't make sense to respond to that by introducing a bill that's equally vague, that gives the police more opportunity to abuse their authority against protesters. I mean, that just sends a signal that the leadership, the political leadership of the state is not getting it, and it's going to alienate people, it's going to lead to more adversarial responses, and that's something I know for a fact. Thank you.
Thank you, Randall. Any questions? Thank you.
So, this bill in concept is a lot better than the one that came before. As I was saying, this is the this is at least intended to focus directly on the issue that was supposed to prompt this, on the issue of blocking an interstate highway. So I'm glad that this bill doesn't have a lot of the overreaches that were in the other bill, which we've heard so much convincing testimony against. However, since this bill does face the issue a little more squarely, we do have to look at the pros and cons in order to create another time, and that's something that I'd like to talk about. There are also some drafting errors in this bill that need to be corrected. First of all, the issue of what kind of roads this applies to. I noticed that the majority of people who spoke in favor of either of the two bills tended to say that they were wanted a bill that would address blocking an interstate highway. Tony Capezza used that language, blocking an interstate highway. In his initial testimony in favor of the felony bill, he said you can't be blocking an interstate highway. Representative Canario also made clear that he was not talking about streets that are designated as state or federal highways. He was talking about actual freeways. Barry Schiller, in suggested amendments, said that it should be made clear it was blocking an interstate highway. Nobody who's advocated for any of these bills has defended applying it to any kind of road or even any kind of numbered route except for an interstate highway. And I think that's good. As I explained in my testimony before, the interstate highways are the limited access roads that actually do cause a serious problem if you have people blocking them. So I am here to support Barry Schiller's proposed amendment that it should just say clearly interstate highway, because the definition of freeway that's currently in this bill is inadvertently too broad. So let's be clear about that. Senator Reptakis did, in his testimony, suggest broadening it a little bit more. He said not just the interstate highway itself, but also the on-ramps and off-ramps, and even the overpasses. Again, that's too much of an overreach. That language isn't in any of these bills, and it poses a number of serious problems. First of all, if there is any blockage of the on-ramp or off-ramp, that's not a thing that causes any serious problem. People who block we've all seen occasions when the on-ramp or off-ramp is blocked due to construction. People know how to go around it. They'll go off the other exit, and it's not a big deal. And it doesn't cause these problems of ambulances that people were talking about. Because an ambulance can easily come through with sirens without having to be backed up way behind there, an ambulance can easily come through with sirens and get past. So you don't have the problem of on-ramps or off-ramps. The problem of interstate highways is if somebody actually blocks them, you do have a backup that extends all the way back, and it does cause problems for emergency vehicles. So if you have questions about that, I'd be glad to talk about that more. The other problem with extending it to on-ramps and off-ramps is it's well known this is an area that's often used by homeless people, often used by people appealing for funds. If you block that area, then if you make a law that applies to that area, it actually risks being used in way too broad ways. And I think we agreed beforehand we don't want to have a law that applies to what homeless people do. We want to have a law that actually applies to serious traffic obstructions. And the fact is, the laws are always enforced too harshly against homeless people, and this law may be one of them. So I don't think this should be applied to on-ramps and off-ramps. Even more so, it should not be applied to overpasses. I know that this bill does say it shouldn't prevent lawful protests. But that doesn't mean that this law won't be applied to protests, because the language in this law does not exclude, does not contain any carve-out for protest activity. It just says that it can't be construed in a way that completely prevents protests. Well, if you prevent people from having to protest on highway overpasses, that may not make it completely impossible to have protests. It just designates all the overpasses in the state as a no free speech zone. But there are very good reasons why people who want to send a message to the public often choose highway overpasses. That's one of the few places where you can actually hold up a sign and have large numbers of people see it. And it's not dangerous to have people hold up a sign on highway overpasses. I've done it in the past. I know where to stand. I stand on the Broad Street overpass, the southern Broad Street overpass over 95, not the northern one. You hold it up, and people see the sign, but people see lots of things while they're driving on the highway. When people are driving on the highway and they see an accident on the other side of the road, that's a hell of a lot more destructive than having somebody stand up with a sign on the overpass. If somebody's there, we all seen people with an accident, that causes big traffic slowdowns, can cause traffic jams just by rubbernecking. We never see those kinds of traffic jams happening just by somebody holding up a sign. So again, there's no reason to apply this to overpasses, and the fact that sponsors are still insisting on applying this to overpasses shows that this is an effort to restrict speech and to go way beyond the single more severe incident that we saw when people were actually blocking traffic on the interstate. So that part is completely unreasonable. So the last point is we've heard talk about public safety, but really there are public safety concerns on both sides. When the sponsors of this legislation appeal to considerations of public safety, they all talk about theoretical harms that have not happened. They say, theoretically, there might be a problem with an ambulance that hasn't happened, and if it does happen, it would be very rare. But the people on the other side who have been opposing this legislation have been saying, look, there's a big problem with public safety where people are getting killed by police who are poorly trained, who are not trained in how to deal with issues well. And that's an issue of public safety that, I'm sorry, our legislators have not dealt with adequately. So the one issue of public safety where there are proven harms is not being addressed at all, despite all the successful effort to call it to public attention. And the area of public safety where there's only theoretical harms is being addressed energetically with lots of bills, with stronger penalties, and again, that's completely inappropriate. So basically, I think that if this bill is to pass, it should be amended to make clear that we're talking only about interstate highways. It should be clear I think it should be also amended to make clear that we're only talking about intentionally restricting traffic. Because when it's right here, it says intentionally or knowingly or recklessly, and that applies to all sorts of actions which have nothing to do with the original event that was supposed to motivate this legislation. It should be, if you want to add tougher penalties, make it only for people who intentionally restrict traffic. Otherwise, as Steve Brown pointed out, this covers far too wide a swath of things. So definitely this bill still needs to be amended if it's going to cover the problem that was advertised and not end up being an effort to bar protests more generally. But I think the main point to remember about this is if you want to address this theoretical public safety threat, it will be a lot easier to swallow if the legislature was also willing to introduce and pass legislation that does something about the more serious public safety threat where innocent people over and over again are being killed or wounded by poorly trained law enforcement officers who are supposed to protect us. And we all wish that things would be better and that these law enforcement officers would work more in our best interest. And most of them want to, but unfortunately they're poorly trained and they're not held accountable enough. So because the plan seems to be to pass this legislation without addressing the more serious problem, it is going to have an alienating effect even if it's fixed. And for that reason, I'm very skeptical about this bill, even if it is amended. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?